Good evening. I want to give you the first supplementary video to the 2-minute summary professional shoot that I talked about yesterday. And I'll start out by pointing out that the early part of this will talk about the second book, something from the second book, DoAskDoTell When Liberty is Stressed. Then we'll go back to talking about some material from the first book, or basically all three books. Let's go to the file, and I'll play some of it.
Things like public health, talk about how HIV was very different from COVID, but you'd have to talk about them both because they're very different and compare them. You know, you'd have to talk about a lot of things to bring it up to date. Even conscription, and during the Vietnam era and the draft and the fact that we had student deferments and then we had a lottery. Well, today in a war in a civilized country in the Ukraine, all men 18 to 60 are automatically in the military. They're not civilian. They can be bombed, as you're finding out. In a civilized country, to see that happen, it's horrific. You know, people in Poland are taking in refugees into their home. It's kind of not even voluntary. You kind of almost have to. What's going on in the rest of the world does matter to these kinds of arguments. But you can't say all that in 2 minutes. You know, you'd have to do a whole, if you wanted to do the Bill of Rights 2 idea, which is the second book, you have to do a whole Netflix series or something and have a different episode on each problem, and then bring each problem up to date, particularly with the Alito stuff, the Supreme Court stuff or something. Even their gun rights, even the Second Amendment, restricting guns. In 2008, the Supreme Court said that the right to bear arms is an individual right. That's been debated on Twitter a lot. I didn't talk about that in the book, but that's another thing that you would have to talk about if you made a series now.
Okay, let me go to the next section. Which is at 4. Have to keep track. It's 4 minutes and 40 seconds.
Things like public health, people's freedom, the power, you know, the power grid could go out to the war or something. That kind of thing happens today, just extending. So that was the main issue. Also, the fact that I was an only child, which meant my parents wouldn't have a lineage. That was the other big thing. And then my coming out story, there are a lot of episodes, but particularly when I was in the Army myself, I took the draft physical 3 times because I didn't want the stigma of the psychiatric treatment. When I finally served, I actually was behind physically as a male, but I got to where I could pass the physical, the PCTP, by going through special training for 4 weeks. That's interesting. And again, some of these things would be very harrowing to film if you actually showed what they were really like, you know, in detail. A lot of people don't know what this was like then. I think that's everything I want.
Okay, I will go on to the next little section about how I felt about the Don't Ask, Don't Tell pursue policy that Clinton proposed. I think that's the next little section. I'm trying to get to the exact start.
In practice, people are often off base and on liberty, and that they should have their private lives just like anyone else. And in practice, they usually did, except when they were deployed in combat. And in combat, that typically there wasn't an issue because people were preoccupied with the realities of combat. When stateside or when home, people should have their own private lives. And so I thought the concept of don't ask, don't tell, don't pursue, at least don't pursue in the beginning was it an advancement of not asking sexual orientation, not asking something very personal, forced outing, in other words. Over time, that's changed because the internet basically erased the idea that people had double lives, for all intents and purposes, that we know. So that kind of people wouldn't perceive it that way. But back in the 1990s, I was also working for a company then that sold life insurance to the military, and that's when Clinton got in, when I decided to write the book. We actually moved to Minneapolis to avoid a conflict of interest, so that the publicity over what I was doing wouldn't cause a problem for the company. This kind of thing does have consequences for people outside the military, even when they're not in it. And that was one of my other major ideas. So that was, but when this started, I thought that Bill Clinton's policy of don't pursue actually was an advance. And I thought that Sam Nunn's idea, or Charles Mosco's idea, that privacy, the lack of privacy in the barracks, was a legitimate concern, because the same idea had come up when I was a college student in 1961. It was pretty much the same thing. By the way, after 9/11, this is in the second book, it's not in the first book, but after 9/11, Charles Moscos actually emailed me that gays should get behind conscription. There was talk of resuming the draft after 9/11 and whether women should be included and that kind of thing. It still is. He said, Don't Ask, Don't Tell would be ended if we did have conscription. He actually emailed that to me in late 2001. So that is part of how I saw it.
Okay, I'm going to go on to a discussion of personal privacy. About 3 more minutes in this particular episode tonight. Start at 9:26. This is a little bit hard to do.
Well, privacy, first of all, my own privacy, my own private life. One place to pursue this is in 1962, I was a patient at NIH for six months, and inpatient on the 3rd floor. And my parents actually had to come in for family art therapy and so forth, which was very traumatic for them. One of the problems was I was, of course, an only child, which is atypical for gay men, but I was. And being an only child, that meant they would not have a biological lineage. That, didn't talk about that very much. But when I was in NIH, it was more that I was very picky about who I would bring into my life for a relationship. And I sort of wasn't in a position where I had a right to be picky, because I wasn't as good at things as other men and boys are supposed to be. So I didn't have a right to be picky. And so that's a very mean-sounding idea right now, but that's how people thought. And you still see that in the cultural wars today. Now, the other thing, I think, the moral limits on personal freedom, you see the left wanting to do it on the basis of race and class and so forth, being your privilege and being part of an oppressor class and so forth. I would see it on the basis of your own karma. Can you earn what you have? Can you show that you did earn what you have? Can you be helpful to other people when they actually need you? Can you change somebody's tire literally in an open road? That kind of thing. Could you get, if we lost electricity for a year because of an EMP attack, could you lead a useful life? I know Tim Pool's asked that question a few times on his IRL program, but yeah, I think that's a valid question. People don't like to talk about it like that. But yeah, I mean, I think with climate change, we may face questions like that. We could. And I don't know if this is on topic or not, but Vladimir Putin himself threatened to send the West to the Stone Age. He actually talked about self-purification. You heard him say some pretty horrible things early in the Ukraine war. People have sort of not been repeating them lately, but something like this could happen. And that's a big where that's on my mind as far as individual rights. That's something I think about a lot.
So the next question I have for you, I want to talk a little bit about your personal story and more.
Okay, I'm going to just show you a few pictures for the rest of this video from that will fit these more into later, to show you a little bit of the scenery of where some things happened. Trying to open a picture and it's not, and it should. That was the house I grew up in. That was a trip with a high school trip to Mount Washington. That's the high school I graduated from. That's it today. Some William and Mary shots. Charlotte, that figures into the story. GW, where I went to undergraduate. NIH, where I was a patient. My Chest, KU, where I was a graduate student. Fort Jackson, where I took basic. New York, where I lived. And then Texas, that's probably enough. So that'll be today's episode, and then I'll pick this up for the rest of the tape and another tape. I'm going to break this up into 2 or 3 segments because it's a little bit easier for me to manage. Thank you for your attention.